Hello, and welcome to the Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring interesting and timely information to you, supporters of refugees. Whether you are a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who is interested in learning more, we hope you enjoy today's session, Refugee Families and School Engagement. The Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, practitioners at resettlement agencies, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. As a reminder for everyone joining the Lunch and Learn today, there is a control panel in the upper right-hand corner of your screen that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. There will be ample time at the end of the webinar for Q&A, so we encourage you to submit questions throughout. Everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any tech issues, please raise your hand through the control panel or submit a question in the questions box and we'll assist you. Additionally, a recording will be sent to everyone of today's webinar, and this brings us to our presenter for today. Our presenter is Laura Gardner. Laura is the founder and lead consultant at Immigrant Connections. Immigrant Connections' vision is a world where educators understand the background, strengths, and needs of immigrant children and families they are working with, and have the information and tools they need to engage and support them as they integrate into their new country. Their mission is to improve the lives of immigrant children and families by helping educators and others better serve the population through training, coaching, and consultative services. Laura founded Immigrant Connections in 2017. She has worked in refugee resettlement as a district manager for immigrant family and community engagement and nationally for bridging refugee youth and children's services, and also as a school social worker. Laura, thank you so much for joining us. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much, Brianne. I'm so excited to be here today. So yeah, I think we could just go ahead to the next slide and we'll dive right in. So the first piece that I wanted to share today to provide all of you out there with a little bit of context. Some of you may be familiar with the Refugee School Impact Program, but some of you may not. And I wanted to just give a little blurb about that because that's a pretty important piece when we're talking about refugee children in, K-12 schools in the United States. So this is funding that comes from the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement, right, or ORR, and it trickles down to the states in various ways, right? It goes to the state refugee coordinator first in every state. Some states kind of hand the money off to their state Department of Education and then distribute it to school districts. Other states primarily use the funding for refugee resettlement agencies to do like after school tutoring programs or summer enrichment programs or parent workshops or things like that. So in some states, it's like all with refugee agencies. Then finally, in some other states, there's kind of a mix where maybe in one part of a particular state, they found that it works best to have the funding go directly to the school district, whereas in another part of the state, maybe it works best to have it in a refugee agency. So anyway, it trickles down in various ways, but you can get a sense of the overall goals of the program are, of course, to strengthen that academic performance of students, but also that social adjustment piece for students and families. The last thing to say about this is that there's also been, since the Afghans have come, some additional money specific for Afghans. So when you get your follow-up email, we can make sure that you get that link there in the bottom to the Afghan Refugee School Impact Supplement. So, oh, and the last thing, I apologize. In the graphic there's a report that I worked on I think it was in 2020. It was right around when COVID was starting, where we really looked at, nationally speaking, kind of how that money trickled down and what different states were doing with this funding. So there's a lot of best practices, and that report, that image is hyperlinked. So we'll get you a PDF version of this where you can click on the different things. So that would be my first suggestion is if you were an advocate or a volunteer out there, is to find out how that money is being used in your state. That's the first point. So next slide, please. All right, so today I'm going to talk about a couple of things. Interpretation and translation services is the first. So next slide, please. So this first idea, when we talk about interpretation and translation services, we're actually talking about what is referred to as language access. And if you've been volunteering in um, refugee resettlement for a while, or working in refugee resettlement, or some kind of advocate, you may know this topic pretty well already, so maybe this is a review. Uh, Brienne, real quick, I keep kind of hearing there's like a humming sound in the background that kind of comes in and out. I don't know if anyone else hears that, but
I
oh, and now we can't hear you anymore. Okay, I'll just keep going. Now it sounds okay. I'll just keep going. It's good. It's good enough. All right.
I
So
don't hear it, but actually, I'd ask if any attendees are hearing a hum, if you'd type it into the questions box, just so that we can try to fix it.
yeah. Okay, cool. All
Okay.
right. So this idea around language access, basically what we're referring to is that any individual who is considered quote unquote limited English proficient, this is the federal government terminology, they need to be able to have equal access to information and programs and services to the same extent as anyone else who does speak English, right? And in the context of schools, we're really talking about parents. Okay, so the federal funding and the federal laws when it comes to students in K to 12 education, that's more about making sure that students receive, ESL services and that they have equal access to the curriculum and that type of thing. So this piece, not so much about students. Really, in the context of education, we're talking about parents, and that parents have access to information from their child's school in a language that they understand. Okay, and so when we talk about interpretation, this is the oral piece, right? So like for a parent-teacher conference, an interpreter needs to be requested because they're going to orally relay the information back and forth, right? Versus a translator, that refers to written information. So that would be like a report card or a field trip permission form or something along those lines, where that needs to be translated into the language that the parent understands, okay? And there was a really helpful memo that came out in 2015. I hyperlinked it below, and you can see in the image there's like a screenshot of it. It came out in 2015 from the US Department of Education and the US Department of Justice. It's 2 pages. Well, there was a longer thing that went along with it, but this particular little tool is the best because it's short, it's sweet, and it's in multiple languages. So it's actually something that you can give refugee parents. It doesn't have all the languages, which is kind of extra ironic. I mean, I know there can't be like 200 versions of it, but I have personally been advocating for it to be in Pashto and Dari, and it is not in Pashto or Dari. So there are advocates out there. Maybe you can also kind of advocate for that to the US Department of Ed. But anyway, you could take a look at it, even just look at the English version and see some of the types of things that schools are supposed to be doing. Okay, so let's go to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit more about this. So here are a few key points, okay, that anyone volunteering, anyone working in refugee resettlement or volunteering, you really need to know this. So that 2-page guidance is very clear that it doesn't matter if the student is an English learner, it's the parent's level of English, okay? So, you may have, let's say, I don't know, you may have an Afghan student that is an English learner for the first few years, and then let's say they test out and they're no longer, receiving those services, but mom and or dad and or whoever the caregiver is, they may need interpretation or translation services in Dari or Pashto for many years to come, right? So that is something that schools struggle with. I will tell you that from having worked in both refugee resettlement and education, because students who are English learners are flagged in a very specific way that they kind of get more attention. But I think sometimes when you've got families where it's like just the parent that needs support and not necessarily the student, those kind of get lost sometimes. Then this ties in nicely with the second bullet there. So the memo is very clear that schools are supposed to be tracking parents preferred languages and whether or not they'd like or need, interpretation translation services. I can also tell you that that doesn't necessarily always happen. I'm sure many of you know that. But I think what I always tell schools, because I do a lot of our trainings, I mean, the majority of Immigrant Connections trainings are actually for educators. Um, and sometimes people will see some of this information and be like, wow, that's pie in the sky. Like that is so far from reality, right? But what I always argue is that we have to at least know what we're supposed to be doing, right? So that we can help get there. Start, maybe we're over here and figure out how we're going to get from A to B slowly, B to C, C to D, and move our way towards where we need to go. So next slide, please. All right, so a little bit more about this. The memo, again, it's very clear that language assistance must be provided by appropriate and competent staff. Okay, um, what does that mean? They're a little bit vague, but in general, they say that whoever the employee is or the contractor or whatever, they have to be assessed in both languages and receive some sort of training in interpreting. That memo is super clear that it's not enough just to be bilingual. And for those of you maybe who are kind of newer to this work, that might be a little confusing, but let me just say that, you know, just because one speaks, um, you know, fluent English and fluent, Dari or Pashto or whatnot, doesn't necessarily mean they know how to interpret. Like that's going back and forth between two languages. It's a very, not only is it a high level skill set that takes a lot of practice and training, but also interpreters who are trained, they receive information on confidentiality, um, ethics, other important topics that, you know, generally you're not necessarily going to know that. I don't want to say just because you know two languages, but hopefully, you kind of know what I mean when I say that. Then moving down that list of bullets there, the memo is also very clear. We are not supposed to use students, okay? And I would argue this is good practice too, in just forget the schools for a minute, even just in refugee resettlement, volunteering, whatever, not using our children, our child clients as interpreters. It really throws off the family dynamics, right? It gives all the power to the kids, not to mention that I can tell you from both resettlement and from schools, I'm sure Brienne and Grace could share too, lots of funny stories about the things that kids say. There's a video clip, we won't be able to show it today, but we'll include it in the follow-up resources where there's a particular 30-second chunk in the video where the teacher has a student interpret for his own parent-teacher conference, and he says, "I'm doing great," and the teacher's trying to say, "You're struggling in math," and the kid keeps saying, "I can play more after school." She says, "No problem," So it's just one of those situations that you can imagine how kids, they would be able to kind of take advantage of that situation if they wanted to. And then finally, the last bullet there, um, all of us, cannot only rely on Google Translate or other apps. Now, the federal lingo around this is a little bit still vague. Like the jury's kind of still out on this, but um, you can go on the US Department of Education website. They have specifically the Office of Civil Rights page, as well as some of these lawsuits that come about for this type of thing are also on the Department of Justice webpage. But anyway, one can go online and read some of the settlements. For example, Arlington Public Schools in Virginia got a lawsuit around this area, and it's very clear when you read the lawsuits that you cannot only rely on Google Translate. They don't explicitly state that in the memo that I've been referring to, but again, you can see it in some of the settlements and that type of thing that's come out. So anyway, hopefully that is helpful, just kind of some of the basics. So next slide, please. Oh, two resources I wanted to provide. So from our Immigrant Connections blog on our website, um, I would say this. Let me start actually with the one on the right. For those of you who are, refugee resettlement volunteers and that type of thing, and you're kind of in that sort of advocate role, maybe take a look at that one because that's immigrant and English learner, of course, includes refugee, parent advocacy. And I can tell you from working in the schools, I used to coordinate um, immigrant and refugee family and community engagement for a large district in Maryland. And I can tell you, parent voice, parent advocacy is very, very crucial to changing things. If you are a volunteer, great. If you're refugee resettlement staff, great. Even teachers, we can speak till we're blue in the face, but until the powers that be hear it directly from a refugee student or parent or community leader, it's you need their voice. They're not just going to necessarily listen to, advocates and that type of thing. So if you read this article, it kind of lays that out a little bit more. And then I include a number of video clips in here of parents, immigrant and refugee parents, testifying in front of their school boards and advocating for particular things, whether they want more tutors for their kids, more interpreters, more help, and how they're struggling due to the language barriers and that type of thing. So take a look at that. And then the one on the left is written more for educators. But so if you're working with a school district, let's say, again, as your volunteer kind of advocate role, and you're working with a group, maybe a central office administrator or a principal or I don't know, whoever, and they are interested. They're ready to make some changes, right? They know that what they're doing is not quite cutting it in terms of what's laid out in that memo, but they don't know what to do, right? They don't understand how do I fulfill these requirements? Give them this article because we lay out very clearly here's what you need to do. Here's a spectrum of options. Okay, best case scenario, kind of worst case scenario, or kind of like most meaningful communication to least meaningful communication. And what are your options? So that could be something you could just send them the link and it's like all right there. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so here's our second topic for our Lunch and Learn. Just wanted to share a little bit on orienting refugee students and families. So let's go to the next slide, please. All right, first and foremost, do families know that they can engage? Okay, so this is like the $1 million question. Some of you are probably newer to this work, some of you have been in this work for a long time and you probably know what I'm getting at, right? But in many, many, many countries and cultures around the world, you don't just show up at your child's school. In many cultures and countries, that is considered disrespectful. It's considered challenging authority. Um, there are just all sorts of different cultural nuances going on. So first and foremost, whenever we help orient families, whether it's like us as refugee providers and volunteers, or if it's on the school district side, if they're kind of doing some of the orientation, I tell everyone the first thing we need to do is help families understand what do we mean by kind of parent involvement or family engagement, and what does that look like in the context of, um, a U.S. school. And I will say this too, that there has been a lot of progress in terms of school districts and kind of strategies and tools and research-based practices for family engagement, particularly over the past like 10 to 15 years. So I remember I actually used to work intern many years ago at CWS when they had the overseas processing entity in West Africa in 2005, four, five, I forget. I interned with it was the culture orientation team where they were processing, all the West African refugees coming to the US. And I remember the unit, the little smidge of a unit that was on kind of education and then parent involvement. It was like join the PTA. And then it like was like next topic. Family engagement is so not just that, right? It's so much more. And so a lot of the coaching and training that I do for educators is around understanding that family engagement is around relationship building and that it's a process of relationship building, not some kind of event to just sort of like check off your list, right? So I have a lot to say about this. And so for some of you, I think it will depend on your context. Some school districts and some states are much further along in kind of understanding family, like best practices in family engagement than others. Some districts are still pretty old school and have not kind of gotten there yet. But I can tell you just, I don't know, like off the top of my head, like Philadelphia Public Schools, they have a whole family and community engagement team. They have staff going out and doing home visits. There's another research-based strategy called academic parent-teacher teams. So anyway, there's a lot to know about that. Um, if you're interested, I will say this. I mean, if you go to the Immigrant Connections web page on our blog, we have a lot of blog posts about family engagement, which of course are free. And then I do also teach some like self-paced online classes. So if anyone's really interested in this topic, I could give you loads of resources. But for now, we'll go to the next slide. Might be a little TMI. Okay, so back to the kind of narrow part about orientation. I'm not going to read this, but this is just one, kind of laundry list of the types of things that one would need to know, right? A newcomer, someone brand new to this country, I mean, my gosh, everything from, again, there's communicating and engaging with school. That's point number one, right? How do I engage? Why am I engaging? What do I engage on, right? All of that. But then all the little things that we take for granted for those of you who are born and raised in the US. It's like, oh, our school calendar generally goes from like the end of August or early September till sometime around June. Well, in many other countries, it starts in January, right? Or it's different. Um, Obviously grades and levels and what is elementary, middle, high, like that can all be different. I'll look at a couple other ones here. Weather closings, definitely a big one. Lots of immigrant and refugee families think that when it rains, you don't have school, things like that. Um, let's see, what else do I want to highlight on here? Oh, I remember back when years ago, I'm looking at the one on transportation. I still remember we had this I think she was Liberian. Actually, I don't remember, but it was, let's just say West African mom who, why would she know that school buses are yellow, right? Who knows that unless someone tells you? So she thought public transportation. She got on the school bus with everybody else. The school's like, what are you doing, right? So all of these types of things in a perfect world, I know it's not a perfect world, but families would get some sort of information on all of these topics. All right, next slide. Okay, so for some of you, you're like, well, that's a lot. Like, where do I begin? Well, the good news is there is lots of information out there that you can, borrow, right? You don't have to reinvent the wheel necessarily. So I'm also a consultant for Switchboard, which is another one of the federal government's technical assistance providers. And through a request that they got that they kind of funneled to me, I actually put together about maybe 6 months ago or so, a spreadsheet of materials that were created by those refugee school impact programs that I mentioned in the very first slide. And so it is like open and editable. Makes me a little nervous, but if you have things, that the refugee organization that you're volunteering with or whatever, that something should go on there, go ahead and add it, right? And then there's a folder, a Google folder that goes with it where you can upload materials. They're hyperlinked in this document here. And again, Brienne, we can figure out the best way. I'm happy to share just the like PDF with them, or you can do a separate thing. But so take a look at that. Those materials are created by folks within the refugee resettlement world, as well as school districts that specifically have that refugee school impact funding. Okay, so you can take a look at those, and then let's go to the next slide. I wanted to share also kind of how we advise schools to do this. So in some, you know, again, it varies depending on what part of the country, but in a lot of schools, whenever they get, generally the lingo is like newcomer. They won't necessarily say refugee, immigrant, whatever. They may say, oh, for our newcomers, we provide them this, that, or the other orientation. So let's take a look at some of those examples. You can go to the next slide. So there's kind of three main options, okay? Either just, in person, or of course it could be on Zoom, but something where it's, kind of live, right? And synchronous, where you go through some kind of PowerPoint and uh, with interpreters and, that type of thing. And of course that can be, there's, pros and cons to all these. So in that scenario, uh, obviously you can answer people's questions in real time. Um, you're able to engage more directly with people, etc. So that's good. But the major con for this is that, as you and I all know, all of us know, refugees don't just come at like mid-August, right? Like they're coming all throughout the year. So in the one school district I used to work in, we did a pretty good job of doing a big back to school orientation for our newcomers, but we did a really not good job at all the other newcomers that came throughout the year. So this, in my mind, is not actually the best option, at least from like a school district perspective. It may be the best option for some of you. But let's look at option two, if you go to the next. Okay, so option two, a lot of schools and some of your organizations probably have some kind of handbook, right? Now, all school districts, at least that I've ever worked with, both as an employee and as a consultant, which is in a number of states at this point, all have some kind of parent handbook, right? That's not exactly what I'm talking about, because that's full of legalese, that's full of tons of information, like every possible discipline scenario on the planet Earth, etc. I'm talking about something that's much more specifically designed for immigrant and refugee parents, like basic information covering those topics that we talked about earlier, like school buses are yellow, right? So there's just two examples here that both have hyperlinks on them. This was one that was created years ago by Illinois. And then our federal government through USCIS actually has a handbook as well in multiple languages, that, may be useful as well. So you can take a look if you're volunteering, if your refugee clients are all going to, a school district or two, see what's, do they have, maybe the whoever oversees English learners, newcomers, check out and see, maybe they have something that you're not even aware of. Okay, which takes us to option three. Next slide. And you can click it one more time. I think the graphic is, there we go. So option three is frankly my favorite. So option three is, there are a lot of school districts that are creating videos now. So just a couple random examples, but Granite School District in Utah, go Granite. They have this nice multilingual video in 14 languages, including lots of refugee languages, not just like Spanish, Mandarin, etc. Lots of refugee languages. And, a lot of our clients, you know, may not have necessarily strong literacy in their native language. So while a handbook might be good for some, that video and seeing the visuals, like I'm just thinking about if I moved to China, like I don't know what their schools look like, right? Like I need the visual. What is happening during the day? So this really provides some great visuals, and then it rules out some of the literacy related issues if you're hearing, someone's narrating the information for you. And I've seen different examples, right? So the one on the left in Granite, they did a whole thing, like beginning to end, right? All the topics packed in. Whereas this example on the right, this was Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland, they chunked theirs. So you go to their page and it's the Spanish page, and then it's the, Farsi page. I don't know. I don't know all the languages they have. And then you just click on, you know, school buses, or you click on, how do you contact the school, or whatever little snippet that you want to know about. Okay, I think that might be it. Do I have another slide? Let me see here. What's next? No, I think that takes us are ready to the Q&A. That was kind of a lot of information, but I'm happy to try to answer as many questions as we have. We still have at least 10, 15 minutes, right?
We do, yes. So we can get to some of these questions here, and I also encourage anyone else to provide any questions that come up as well. There is a question. You mentioned Pashto Dari speakers. Have you seen any other good Pashto Dari resources out there that you would recommend, Laura?
Yes, actually, on our blog, I could try to, I don't know if I could pull this up quickly or maybe Brienne, you can, but on our blog on Immigrant Connections, one of the top most recent articles, I think it's maybe like the second one down, we did a whole thing on orienting Afghan families to K to 12 schools. And it basically, we kind of like pulled together all of the resources we were available in Dari and Pashto, again, more from kind of that orientation lens. I am a little bit less familiar because my background is more social work and refugee resettlement and things and family engagement. I have not taught English myself. I've never been like an ESL teacher. So from an instructional standpoint, I'm not as tuned into, the best like instructional resources, like what's the best dictionary? Like that's not really my area of expertise. But did you find it by chance, Brienne?
Yeah, and I'm going to put the link into the chat.
Okay, cool. And I do have one other thought on that. I don't know if I'm gonna pronounce it right, but that Targumly, do you know what I'm talking about, Brienne?
Mhm.
That app that provides it's real-time interpretation translation support through crowdsourcing, like around the world. So that I know, have Dari and Pashto speakers in their pool of people. And I've talked to their executive director before, and I've played around with the app a little bit, but that um, sometimes can be a good resource too.
Yeah. And actually, if you go to our resource library, Tarjimly did a lunch and learn for us where they like showed you how to
Oh,
download it all.
oh,
Yeah.
perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many, like, there's been so many resources that have come out. It's like almost hard to keep track of them all, but I think my blog is probably the best place to start since I pulled those together. Granted, that was about a year ago now, so I probably need to update that, but it's a good place to start.
Yeah. Let's see some other questions. Are schools required to provide documents in the parent's language or just an interpreter to help explain?
Very good question. So, okay, there are some state laws out there that have some specific nuances with this, so check your state law. Like Maryland, for example, does have a state law, but in general, well, in general, if you needed a clear-cut yes or no, I would say no. It's more like as long as you provide them with access to the information in some way, shape, or form, right? So, and they're supposed to be looking at the percentage of parents that speak a particular language, right? So let's say you have a school district that has like 10,000 Spanish speaking parents and like 50 Pashto speakers. They're not gonna translate the written forms in Pashto, especially if they're in like a bunch of different schools. If it's one school, maybe, right? But realistically, the workaround is going to be um, explaining the information orally through there's a number of phone interpretation vendors, right? So in the DC area, like Language Link is one that's, I mean, it's actually used in many states, but like that's the one that we used to use in the school district, one of the school districts I used to work in. I know there's Language Line, there's like Propio, I don't know, there's a bunch of them. So that would be one workaround. And then of course, having like a human interpreter explain the content of things. The laws get a little stricter with like IEPs and special ed, the individual education programs. I know there was a law passed again in Maryland, just because that's where I'm most on the ground experience, where I believe it stated, and this was like after I left the schools, but I'm pretty sure in Maryland they're supposed to be translating the IEPs too. Um, so sorry, that's a little vague. It depends on numbers, et cetera. But if you look, oh, where could I easily refer this to you? There's this thing called the four-pronged approach that like if someone makes a complaint, right, with the Office of Civil Rights, there's these um, four things, for lack of a better word, that they look at, and one of them is that the number of, again, number of parents. One does have to do with the cost. I forget the other two off the top of my head, but if you kind of Google that, you might be able to find a little bit more. I hope that helps.
Yeah. Let's see. And then are if parents do not read, are schools obligated to respond to getting communications out to them?
Yes, I believe in the two-page guidance, or maybe it was that memo that I referred to, or maybe one of the longer guidance pieces that I've seen, they specifically say, even if they're not literate in their native language. Um, I'll have to look at the wording, but yes, they have to then provide um, oral, interpretation. I'm just pulling that up really quick to see if I see it in here. I don't know if you see it.
Yeah, and we can, as
Yeah.
mentioned, we'll send out the link
Okay.
to.
Yeah, but I'm positive about that. I've seen that written in federal guidance that if they're not literate, that's no, you still have to provide communication orally then in the language
Mhm.
they understand.
And I mean, I think that there is let's see that there's lots of different levels that you could answer this on, but what do you do, say you're like a volunteer or a sponsor, what do you do if the family that you've welcomed doesn't seem to be getting interpretation in any of the like calls home or parent teacher conferences or anything like that? What are some different ideas of things
Yeah,
you could do?
right, which I'm sure is many of you, right? Because again, here's the laws, and here's in reality, I don't know if you see my hands, where both most school districts are, right? So I know I'm not saying like here's how it is. I mean, there's a big disconnect, right, between kind of policy and practice. So probably where I would start, let me think about this. I would probably first look over the school district's website closely, right? Like search interpreter, search the word translator. Like, is there any kind of person or department at that school district who oversees that? If there is, hey, fairly easy peasy, possibly, right? Maybe they're just the parents just isn't coded properly in the school max or whatever other centralized database they use, right? You could call up the office with the parent and kind of make sure they get coded properly. Okay. Another place to look, of course, is whatever the districts, whoever oversees their supports and services for English learners. We don't tend to say ESL too much anymore, at least not in K to 12. That's like 20 years old. So if you see ESL, I mean, or I wouldn't necessarily Google that. It's more going to say either like Office of English Learners or Office of Multilingual Learners. Um, Maybe ESOL, English for Students of Other Languages, but find out who oversees that. And that's also a good person to try to email or reach out to and find out. Then also honestly, the school's principal. If it's a high school, that might be a little harder, but if it's elementary, or even middle, reaching out directly to the principal is a good place to start. And then ultimately, if you're in a district where they're flat out not doing it, they kind of know they're supposed to be, but they're like, whatever, and they're just kind of like not doing it at all and being difficult. Um, I would honestly, I mean, this would take time, right? But I would be like kind of coaching and helping to teach the parents about their rights and seeing if you could get a small group, maybe one, two, three people who are willing, or even probably have a community leader involved if possible, and go to a school board meeting. I know that sounds scary. Maybe if you can watch some of those videos that I included in that one that one article about parent advocacy, but that honestly will do it. Like that is so powerful. There was even one example. I don't necessarily recommend doing this. You have to be really careful about this. But in one of the districts I used to work in, our school district was really pretty good about providing interpreters, but our budget process involved the county, right? The county council had to like kind of sign off on their part of it. And so they also had budget hearings. And even though we kept giving them a heads up that we needed them to provide interpreters, because this was like their thing, they didn't. So one of our immigrant parents stood up, said her testimony in Spanish. No one understood what she was saying, and she sat back down, and it made her point. It made the government officials look like fools, honestly. And so I don't necessarily encourage that approach. It was really kind of rut-row. How is this going to go? But it worked in our case. So that's something to think about.
Let's see, and I was just putting in that I had a few people ask for the link to that, the language access memo. So I just chatted that out to everyone as well. And I like
Perfect.
how you mentioned too, like even like calling with the newcomer parent just to make sure that they were like categorized correctly. Because that way maybe they know like, oh, I can just call, yeah, that they can reach out and make that connection as well.
Right.
Let me see. Like I said, we had some requests.
Yeah.
Um,
I can tell you this, in the districts that do language access well, which there are probably like 10 in the United States, but the ones that do it well have a phone interpretation system in place on top of, interpreters in person and that type of thing. So you could have a parent that would call a front office, like a school secretary, right? And those secretaries would have training, and they know a parent can say like, I need help, Swahili. And then the secretary loops in the language link or language line or whatever company they use, and they're able to do a three-way call and have the interpreter right there. I mean, again, maybe it sounds pie in the sky, but like we made that happen in the district I worked in. It's not really that hard. It takes, again, advocacy from parents and community leaders and people like you. So,
yes. Let's see. I had a question about, do you have any thoughts on early childhood education access and screening practices for refugee children?
I don't really. I mean, from like a language access perspective, is that kind of what they're asking, or more like families that don't have access to information about early childhood stuff?
Let's see. Probably more general. It says advising dash early childhood screening practices that are equitable for refugee children.
I guess I would need a little more information. Like if you're thinking, when you say screening, that makes me think a little bit of, some of you may know that the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act kicks in at age 3. Actually, some of the stuff is even earlier, like the infants and toddlers stuff. So if you're thinking about screening in terms of like if there's a concern about child development, is that kind of where the person is going with that? Shoot, I can't hear you now, Brienne. Oh,
Sorry, that was me.
there we go.
Let's
Okay.
see. The language and lack of experience. The screening tasks required before kindergarten entrance
Oh,
seem
okay.
inappropriate.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, it's tricky too, right? Because and I actually okay, so let me just say this. Early childhood is not my area of expertise. Um, but I do recall, for example, where I worked in Maryland, supports for English learners had to be in place for kindergarten and above. But we had pre-K in our elementary schools, but for some reason, based on funding and laws and all the things, they weren't given those supports. So we had like 3 and 4 year olds that weren't receiving services for English learners and were just kind of like thrown to the wolves. And then once they turned 5 and were in kindergarten, it was like, oh, now you get all these support services. So I don't know. I'm sure I'm not answering your question. I don't think I'm maybe the right person to answer that question. Sorry, I don't have more for you.
I know. Thank you, Laura.
Yeah.
Let's see, and thanks to this person who's trying to help out some early childhood folks
Okay,
there.
good.
Yeah, let me see. Um, yeah, I think that we have gotten to most of our questions here. So we will go ahead and wrap it up. But like I said, we're going to send out an email with a lot of links to those helpful resources that Laura has mentioned. So thank you again so much, Laura, and thank you to everyone for attending today's Lunch and Learn. We'd love to hear from you and receive any feedback on today's Lunch and Learn or hear suggestions for future topics. We ask that you take a moment now to complete the survey. You can use your phone to follow the QR code on the screen, or there will be a link in the chat. And we also look forward to hearing from you. You'll receive that follow-up email with a link to a recording of today's, as well as the resources that Laura will share. And on behalf of Refugee Welcome Collective, thank you, Laura, and thank you all for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for
Happy
joining.
holidays, everyone.